Hello everyone, welcome to Sermon Prep. Today we're looking forward to the 17th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year B. We also need to remember, keep in the back of our minds if we can, that this Sunday is also the World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly. The Holy Father has declared this day a day for us to remember and give thanks and to see the value of the elderly in our families and in our communities. And we've received a lot of information regarding this day from the Dicastery for the Laity, Family and Life. That dicastery is headed up by Cardinal Farrell, an American. And they've given us suggestions for prayers of the faithful, to reach out and look at our pastoral action towards the elderly. And it has also given us some pointers regarding the readings for this Sunday. And they have emphasized the importance of community, of the value there is in recognizing, accepting and giving space and time for all people. That comes out very clearly in our second reading from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Remember, we have been looking at that letter for a couple of weeks now. And in my previous two sermons, I have spoken about the value of community. You will remember last week I spoke about being an inclusive community, not an exclusive community. And if we extend that to this day where we recall the elderly, our grandparents, the Holy Father is asking us to make sure that we have a space, a place for the elderly, for our grandparents in our families, for those who have the wisdom and the depth of life that comes from many years being on the earth, being in our communities, being in our families. The Holy Father asks us to respect that and to value and treasure that experience and that wisdom, because it adds to the community. And so these previous two Sundays that have spoken about community is given a greater emphasis this Sunday in the documents that have come from this Roman dicastery. And so we need to keep that in the back of our minds, the importance of community. As we celebrate this Sunday, as we look at the readings now, let's keep that in mind, shall we? Good. So what are the readings for this 17th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year B? The first reading is taken from the second book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 42 to 44. The responsorial psalm is Psalm 145. And as I said, the second reading is taken from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. And then surprisingly, our gospel is not taken from St. Mark's gospel. Remember, during Year B, most often, most Sundays, have a gospel from Mark. But we take a break for a couple of, well, more than a couple, several Sundays now. We take a break from Mark's Gospel and we read this Sunday from St. John's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. That chapter of John's Gospel, I hope, rings a few bells for you, chapter 6, because it contains the bread of life discourse. It speaks of that wonderful miracle of the multiplication of the loaves. And Jesus goes on in that chapter to say that he is the bread of life. He feeds and nourishes the hungry. So it has, for us, Eucharistic undertones. And in fact, if you go and look at John's Gospel, you will see that he doesn't really talk about the Eucharist in the context of the Last Supper, Holy Thursday, as the other Gospel writers do. You know what the Holy Thursday Last Supper story is in John's Gospel, don't you? The washing of the feet. Remember, Holy Thursday evening. John doesn't give a Eucharistic story, really. It's found here in the 6th chapter of his Gospel. It's important, this extract, because there are a number of things that we need to take account of. First of all, this Gospel is found in other Gospels. The story of the multiplication of loaves is found in the other Gospels. We know that. But St. John has an interesting point that's different, that is not found in any of the other Gospel stories. The little boy brings the offerings. It's the little boy who shares, and his gifts are multiplied. And that's really important, isn't it? I think it's important. It emphasizes that God can take the little in our society, the little people and the little offerings, to do incredible things. It's important for us to recognize this. Sometimes perhaps we might get disheartened. We might think, what have I got to give? Who will listen to me? Who will even notice me? Who will accept my ideas, my suggestions, my input? I have very little to give. There are other people with far more. There are other people who are more intelligent, more experienced, people who are known as leaders. Let them do it. No. Little people, little offerings can be used to do incredible things. And I think that's really, really important. Each and every one of us is acceptable to God. Each and every one of us has gifts to offer God for the community. And each and every one of us must play a role in feeding, nurturing, caring for the community. We must never be afraid to offer. So that, I think, is a really important point to keep in mind. The other point that I think is important about this Gospel from the 6th chapter of St. John's Gospel is that we are given the sense that Eucharist is not something passive. Instead, Eucharist is action. The word Eucharist itself means to give thanks, thanksgiving, and that implies action. That implies some sort of activity. Thanksgiving is an action, it is an activity. Eucharist should be an activity, an action. And if we look at this Gospel, the Bread of Life Gospel, and see that St. John, for Holy Thursday, uses the story of the washing of feet, Eucharist as thanksgiving, as action, is given even greater meaning. Jesus gets down on his knees and washes the feet of his disciple. That's clearly action. And so St. John ties up Holy Thursday, the institution of the Eucharist, with action, service, humble service. And in this gospel too, there is clearly action associated with the breaking of the bread, the multiplication of the loaves, the sharing, the boys' offering. And so the theme for this Sunday is clearly about feeding the hungry. Yes, it is about Eucharist, but Eucharist is meant to touch people's lives, change people's lives. It's meant to go outward and transform. It's not something static and held captive by us. Instead, it is used for us to be people of action, of service, of sharing, of building up community. So that's what comes to me from the gospel. If you look at that first reading, the wonderful story of the prophet Elisha. Now, the prophet Elisha is an amazing character. Hey? Remember, he follows from the prophet Elijah. And this story of him being fed and him being able to feed more people is important. Poor people at the time of Jesus would only have had one meal a day. And the fact that there's food left over is remarkable because it can feed again. Now, that would not have been something poorer people in the time of Jesus, and even in our time really too, isn't it, would have expected. They would have eaten one meal, finished the food for that day. There wouldn't have been left over. So this speaks of abundance for poor people, abundance for everyone, that God multiplies so that there is more than we expect. A little bit about the prophet Elisha. I discovered in this little book that the prophet Elisha is the prophet that does more miracles than any other prophet. So here are some of the things that the prophet Elisha did, the miracles he worked more than any other prophet. In the name of God, he multiplies oil for the widow, we remember that. A barren woman has a child. He heals a leper, and he even raises a person from the dead. Okay, so that's interesting, that the prophet Elisha is an important prophet. Also, this reading from the second book of Kings does an important thing. It recalls the manna in the desert. Remember Moses leading the people from Egypt through the desert to the promised land, the Exodus. And they grumble that they are hungry. And God sends manna in the desert, which they collect and eat. So this story of the prophet Elijah, this is happening in the desert, isn't it? And so it has echoes of feeding the people in the desert during the Exodus. It also, of course, links to our gospel, the feeding, the multiplication of the loaves, feeding the 5,000. And so it's an important hinge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's also a link between Moses and Jesus. What did Moses do? He led the people out of Egypt to the promised land. Look at how our gospel starts. At that time, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee, the Red Sea, and a multitude followed him. The Hebrew people followed Moses. So if we if we look at this reading from the second book of Kings, Elisha harkens back to Moses and points forward to the new Moses. I thought that was quite interesting too. So, the second reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians. The first part of that letter is about how Christians behave. Those who have been baptized, how do they live? And it's important for us to remember this. Paul says, I, a prisoner of the Lord, beg you to walk in the manner worthy of your calling, to which you have been called. We're not Christians by accident. We've been called. This is something that is positive. God has called us to this way of life, and we need to live with lowliness and meekness, with patience, forbearing one another in love, and eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That's how Christians should be living, because they have been called, because they have been baptized. So the first part of our reading looks at some of the characteristics of a Christian's life. Because we're baptized, this is how we should be living. The second part builds on the last week, the unity of the community, that we live in the one Spirit. We are one body, we're given the one Spirit of God, and so there is a unity. And so I think that connects to what the Holy Father has asked us to remember in this World Day of Grandparents and the Elderly, that we are all one body, we are one community, we are one family, with old and young, and we need to see the value and importance of that. Okay, so quite a lot there today. I hope that it helps you to prepare for this Sunday. I look forward to seeing you online for our celebration of Eucharist. Let us hope that things change and that we will soon be able to get together. I really think that's important, that we should pray for that we be able to gather to worship in person. Online is great, it has value, but it's even better to be together. And I think we really should be asking the Lord to help us come back together. So, in the meantime, take care of yourselves, look after yourselves, be safe, and we'll see you on Sunday. God bless everyone. Bye-bye.